How do you look at the submarine move? Uh, this could also be seen as a threat.
It's not an easy question because obviously on the surface it should be perceived as a threat. But there have been other threats and other major incidents. I would, go back to September 2022 when the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged in, to me that's probably one of the most aggressive ways that you can attack an infrastructure that impacts multiple countries, right? It wasn't just Russia, it impacted Germany as well. And so Russia hasn't really responded to that. And so it sort of turns into a bit of an issue where some analysts would say that not responding immediately makes Russia come across as weak. Others say it actually makes Russia come across as very diplomatic and not just, having a knee-jerk reaction to every negative thing that happens, including something so significant as the sabotage of this energy pipeline. But the thing here is to note that it's not just a matter of Russia has certain red lines and the West, specifically, especially Britain, the US maybe to the same or slightly lesser extent, and more recently Germany and France, they've been crossing these red lines throughout the course of the escalation and the war in Ukraine, but also previously since the initial regime change in Ukraine in 2014 and the Donbass war that went on for 8 years prior to the launch of the special military operation. So to me, the idea of a red line is not so much that if you do this thing and there's this event, Russia is going to respond. It's also like a time continuum where a certain action at one point in time may not get a response, but 6 months later it actually might. So it's definitely not. I don't want to. I don't want to downplay it, but I also don't want to exaggerate. Trump's actions. Do we really know that he sent these? I mean, I know statements have been made. It hasn't really been identified. And yes, you can say it's a secret, and these are super duper secret nuclear submarines. But certainly, statements like that are very aggressive. But I don't want to go too far in terms of taking them literally. If you kind of look at other statements that come from Trump, a lot of them are aggressive as well. So I think the Russian leadership has been pretty, I would say, pretty patient with everything that's been going on without really having this knee-jerk reaction. Otherwise, we would already be, we would have already experienced some kind of a nuclear war, right? So, but yes, red lines exist in a time continuum. It's not just an event. And so there might be the case when something else triggers a more extreme response. And obviously, that would be very concerning.
Okay. Now let's talk about the Russian and Ukraine war. How do you see it in the future? And what about the people of Russia? Let's start from here. People living in Russia, how do they look at this conflict? Do they think that it's juicing out finances from Russia, or are they saying no, it's okay, let's go in, let's take it over?
I would say there's almost more support for it now based on what they're seeing coming from the West than maybe in the beginning. Now, of course, there is a small percentage of the population that was not happy about this escalation. Some of them went to live in other countries, whether countries nearby like Georgia, or going as far as to live in Europe or North America. So there is that small percentage, but I would say by and large there is a lot of support, and it's not so much that Russians love war because they may know someone who died in this conflict now because it's been going on for so long since the 2022 escalation. They may have had relatives in because of the proximity of Russia and Ukraine, and also the cultural similarities and the integration within the Soviet Union. Lots of people have families in both places, right? So they've been sort of watching this conflict unfold for now 11 years. I would say some Russians wanted the Kremlin to react sooner, and they were disappointed when that hasn't happened, seeing the people die in so-called Eastern Ukraine, right? Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk, and the surrounding areas. I would say that watching the actions coming from the West, whether it's the, well, we don't know who really blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, but the assumption is that it's coming from the West. Like, whom does that benefit? Watching, things like that, watching the seemingly endless spending on Ukraine and pumping Ukraine full of weapons, complete disregard for Russian, not just Russian lives, but just the attempts to maybe negotiate. If we go back to, the initial failed negotiations in Istanbul in 2022 that were presumably undermined by Boris Johnson, right? This was another prime example where Russians are ready to talk. And in fact, the terms of that agreement were very detrimental to Russia, and nonetheless, they were trying to go there, and that basically failed. I would say there, again, it's not so much support for war and death and destruction. It's the support for completing this particular goal. Now, where this would end is not an easy question, because so far the official West continues to pump money into Ukraine, continues to give them weapons, right? The second they stop giving them weapons, that war ends. It's also important to note that we're now on probably at least the third, if not more, Ukrainian army. The initial, unfortunately, the initial people died in the first few months of the war. Then there was this new army that got called up through various waves of conscription, which is why you have all these Ukrainians trying to escape conscription in every possible way and flee across the borders. And now I don't even know which wave of conscription or mobilization we're on anymore, but it's pretty extreme. They lowered the military age. So again, this is sort of NATO using the bodies of Ukrainians to avoid fighting themselves and clashing them with Russians. So from the perspective of having Slavs fight Slavs, it's very sad, even for Russians who may be sort of fed up with Ukrainian ethno-nationalism that's coming out of the World War II and Nazi collaborationism. They're definitely fed up with that, but they still perceive it as maybe not as like a brotherly nation. I mean, some people still do, but as just ultimately we have a huge number of Slavic people dying in this war, and who is benefiting from this, right? It's definitely not Ukrainians themselves, but it seems like obviously the Kremlin is not going to specifically give you the information of this is how far we're going to go if we proceed. My impression is that they have to go pretty far. They have to go, and not necessarily in this way. So for instance, Odessa, right, the city of Odessa, which is a very multi-ethnic city historically because it's a port city on the Black Sea. I believe this is something that will eventually come back to Russia, but it might not come back in the context of actual physical fighting in the battlefield. It might be something that people via a referendum will eventually vote and join Russia with its new territories if Russia is going to keep them. So it might happen in this way. But you now have this situation where if Russia stops now, they obviously, there are lots of I would say the silent majority of Ukrainians probably just want this to be over. And some of them in the beginning of the conflict were, if not pro-Russian, they were either ethnically Russian or they were pro-Russian. They didn't want this to happen. But now, of course, some of them, lots of people fled the country, right? There are a ton of refugees in Russia. I think it's more than 2 million coming from Ukraine. Again, this is something that's not mentioned. Here's this supposed aggressor country, and all of these people are actually fleeing in the opposite direction and are coming in there. And they've been fleeing since 2014, but there's been more refugees since 2022 as well. But you don't want to leave a situation where there are these a small minority, but very loud and very aggressive, armed to the teeth minority of these ethno-nationalists that are motivated by their roots with Nazi collaboration in World War II. And they're obviously very much anti-Russian. You don't want to leave that with some kind of a resolution, right? So there has to be a logical resolution in geographically, but also politically, where this is not going to be an issue. That it's not going to be some kind of almost like this war becoming a founding myth for a new geopolitical entity that would arise where Ukraine and its 1991 borders once was. So if I were advising the Kremlin, which I am not, I would say it needs to be brought to such a logical resolution where Ukrainian nationalism in its ugly form cannot be used as a founding myth. And it cannot be used in a way where NATO is going to come in later and basically start the whole conflict 20 years later. So it's hard to say exactly where that border would be. I mean, a lot of people say it's going to be just past the Dnieper River, because that's sort of the division between East and West in terms of natural geography. But it might be even past that. It's difficult to say. And I'm not a military analyst. This is just me thinking about history and some of those demographic shifts and demographic issues that might arise that I think needs to inform the way the Kremlin operates.